Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this episode, I'm going to talk about authenticity and inauthenticity and bad faith, concepts that come up in existentialism and concepts that can be explored in our day-to-day lives that might reveal a dimension of our experience in a slightly different way. We often hear about the importance of being authentic. People will talk about being their best self or working on themselves. And although this might seem to relate to authenticity, really when somebody's saying, I'm going to be my best self or I'm going to be my authentic self, there can be this relationship to the inauthentic. And what that means is there's a mode of being that is organized in our society, a way of being good, a way of being successful, a way of measuring ourselves, and a way of modeling ourselves to fit within the so-called life of the good or the authentic life. This is a very different way of looking at authenticity, because if we break it down a bit, we notice that this form of authenticity is contingent upon some kind of external criteria. Right? Our best self is out there somewhere. Our experience of self as a true self is out there somewhere. And we need to actualize that through whatever practices. But when I'm talking about authenticity here, I'm actually talking about challenging the very notion that we can adhere to these extrinsic systems and actually be authentic. So one of the familiar examples that Jean-Paul Sartre used to describe this was the idea of the waiter who is acting in bad faith in that they are operating as if they actually are a waiter, right? That they are doing the job as a waiter and that's who they are, where, well, that's actually not who they are. And we know this because we can replace the waiter with another waiter, and there's nothing actually unique that is lost, right? The role of the waiter is replaced by another role of the waiter. Therefore, it is inauthentic for a person to say, I am a waiter. Of course, in a practical sense, they can say, I'm a waiter, I'm a teacher, I'm a therapist, I'm a person doing a podcast, I'm any number of things. But when we get into the question of authenticity, we're really getting into the question of what are we beyond these extrinsic modes of defining and modeling experience. And so to believe that we are these extrinsic things, I'm a guy doing a podcast or a waiter or whatever it is to act in bad faith. And we are doing this because we are telling ourselves that we are unfree. We are telling ourselves that we are operating within a system and that we have no choice, right? That we are set within the bounds of this, being a person doing a podcast, being a person who's a waiter, and so on. And it's the way we convince ourselves that this is what we are. And in convincing ourselves, we are convincing ourselves that we are not anything beyond that. And that is inauthentic, right? We are convincing ourselves of being something, the role, the position, the status, the structure, the constructed notion of self, and so on. All of which have this effect on us, as all of these things create a way of existing that doesn't actually create space for who we are. So let me approach this from a different angle. I've talked more recently, but over the course of these podcasts, about the way in which somatic experience and feeling our body, feeling emotion in our body, feeling tension in our body can take a very different path than thinking that I'm anxious or I'm sad or I'm whatever the thought we're having. To really feel that embodied weight of an emotion has a very different direction. And so similarly here, when we start to get into the question of authenticity, we can be our best selves and we can actualize ourselves and do all these kinds of things. But as I'm arguing, that is moving into the inauthentic, when we move to the authentic, it actually involves something that is a bit of a jolt, a bit of a disturbance. We are cresting an experience that has yet to really been felt, in a sense. What I mean by this is the authenticity isn't a thing per se. It's not like, I have this career, therefore I'm authentic, or I'm doing a podcast, therefore I'm authentic, because that would mean being authentic is what you do. And similarly, it would be counterintuitive in terms of authenticity and inauthenticity to say, well, it's what I'm saying, it's what I'm, putting down on a podcast or writing in an article or whatever it is. But all of these things break away from this other way of experiencing ourselves that operates outside of this kind of quasi-control, blind faith, accepting without questioning, adhering to things based upon rhetorical forms of reasoning, and so on and so forth. Basically, the idea here being is we are challenging the constructs as they emerge, and that is a kind of jolt or break to our existence, because in those moments we realize, what if we are not these things? And that can actually create a state of stress or anxiety, because what if we're not a person doing a podcast? What if we're not a waiter? So I point this out in this way to emphasize that this way of looking at authenticity isn't this euphoric moment of I'm my best self, look at me. It's actually a kind of shattering that we come to realize that the constructed world that we're operating in, including how we are very familiar with ourselves, is itself not an authentic reflection of who we are. Instead, it's a kind of autopilot to our existence. And the authenticity comes in these moments or spurts or jolts that shatter us from these inauthentic or habitual type of actions, hence being the waiter or being the person doing a podcast. And what this starts to do is challenge us to look at the way in which we construct ourselves in the world and the way in which we operate within those constructed notions of the world. So let's take, for example, racism and sexism. Two clearly defined, or at least to me, clearly defined structures in the world, which is to say there is no such thing as racism and sexism as a kind of organic or absolute truth. It's constructed within models of power and control. It is inauthentic, right? To be a racist, to be a sexist is to be inauthentic. And it's being inauthentic because we are believing or trying to believe that we are these things, the racist, the sexist, and instead we are moving away from the authentic experience, which is that we are not these constructed things. And we feel that we have no choice but to be racist or sexist, which is the lie, which is bad faith, because we are telling ourselves that we are unfree, that we cannot break away from sexism and racism and so on and so forth, that we have to operate within that. Now, for example, you might say, well, I'm not racist. I don't see color. And you might say, I'm not sexist. I don't hold these. I'm very open in terms of these things. You're still operating within the construct of assessing based upon race. You're still operating. Doesn't matter what side you're on, quote unquote side. It has to do with the fact that you're operating within a constructed system of race or gender. And this is inauthentic. Again, authenticity here really challenges us to constantly question any construct, not the good or the bad, the right or the wrong. That's not what it's about. It's about challenging the very notion that we exist within a framework that's constructed, and we become convinced, or we convince ourselves, that that is existence. Hence, that we are bound within that system, that we are unfree. Freedom in this sense is not like freedom 55 or freedom to take a trip or anything like this. It's freedom in this sense is almost terrifying, because you are coming to this experience whereby the experience of shattering these constructs is a form of death. You are breaking these patterns that are so habitual in your experience that you start to lose what you had conceived of yourself to be, and in that moment begin to see that those conceptions were actually inauthentic. They were learned, like racism and sexism, as extreme examples, but there's other examples. For example, the way a person teaches, the way a person plays music, the way a person deals with coworkers or communicates with people. All of these things become fodder for the kind of creative, destructive, or deconstructive process that we find within these ways of organizing things that we may have thought we organized them, but really we stepped into them. So perhaps a better analogy here is to think about something that happens where here's an example. You're watching a sporting event, and I don't know much about sports, but it's always fun to use analogies of things that I know very little about. So sporting team A is very good and they're your favorite team. Sporting team B is not as good and you don't like them very much. So you're watching the game and you're having a great time because sporting team A is winning. So you're feeling like this is fantastic. Then all of a sudden sporting team B starts to do well and starts to get better. And all of a sudden the gap that was wide has now been closed. And so sporting team B, whom you don't like and don't think deserve to win and all these kinds of things, wins. So you've had a shattering. The idea that you had of what the outcome was going to be has now broken apart. Interestingly, what do you do in that moment? Think about what you do when something doesn't work out the way you had wanted. What do you then do? Well, in the sports example, we come up with, such and such player wasn't very good, or they had the home court advantage, or, so-and-so was injured on the team, so that kind of, we come up with reasons. We reverse engineer the reasons. We do this all the time. And this is inauthentic. It's an example of being inauthentic because we are trying to put together the constructed experience of life that even though that jolt had told us it was not authentic, we are going back to it because the idea of being free is terrifying. And again, this is not freedom like Freedom 55 or freedom to take a trip. This is freedom to be beyond the constructed notions of your own prejudice, your own preconceptions, or your own, in terms of prejudice, think of it like your own pre-justice, or pre-judgment, your own pre-Judas, if that makes sense. The idea being here is there is actually an anticipatory function of prejudice that is going on that allows us to maintain our inauthentic lives. So another example can be politics, right? People can have a certain political party that they like or don't like. And over time, they may switch parties or start to not like a leader or a party that they liked. And they, again, come up with reasons for that. But what are they avoiding? What is fundamentally inauthentic about that experience? If you watch the news, particularly now in Canada, there's a lot of questions about, the Prime Minister and what's going on. But what's interesting about this is there's something fundamentally inauthentic about this. The idea being is there's such a thing as a perfect, such a thing as a right, such a thing as a good, which is all completely inauthentic. The idea that there was a right response that the Prime Minister should have, or something the Prime Minister should have done. That's just like the sports analogy, where a situation happens that reminds us that we actually have no control at all, and thus completely destroys the inauthentic framework that we're holding on to, because the idea of facing the authentic is terrifying. We would rather hold to an idea that is inauthentic and return to that idea even though we suspect that it is problematic. And we do this even so because the idea of being free terrorizes us. So thinking about the idea of the waiter, I think the example, yes, it illustrates what we're talking about, but it doesn't necessarily go far enough to illustrate the force with which the inauthentic is so key to our lives. We are never going to escape the inauthentic. The idea that I'm going to be my best self, my authentic self, all these kinds of things are fine, but notwithstanding the irony that they're kind of like a branded form of platitude, there is something that is necessary about our own inauthenticity. And to develop a relationship with our inauthenticity is not a negative thing. And far from it. In fact, if we become aware of the way in which and the manner in which we are always and often perpetually inauthentic, and embrace that there are these moments, these jolts of authenticity that shake up that world, and we are not looking to just be authentic and just not be inauthentic. We are starting to understand that there is actually a dialectical process going on within ourselves where we are engaged within a system that is, to a large extent, fundamentally inauthentic. Yet, as individuals and as groups, we start to break or crack or experience the emergent force of authenticity in spite of the experience of the inauthentic. So again, going back to the sports analogy and the team A and team B, the experience that we had in that watching of our team lose was the experience of our own demise, the experience of change, the experience of lack of control, the experience of alienation, the experience of death. Fundamental pillars within existentialism are fundamentally triggered. And so what we want to do is scramble back to any kind of understanding of inauthenticity that saves us from the emotional overwhelmment that comes from facing death, facing alienation, facing a loss of meaning, and the fundamental core angst. So with all of this said, and we're talking about authenticity, and we're talking about inauthenticity and bad faith, how does this play out in our day-to-day lives? Well, when we're interacting with people and they are engaged in a form of inauthenticity, they're playing a role, and you're engaged in a form of inauthenticity, you're playing a role, yet those roles don't seem to align. So now what we're doing is we're fighting over who's right? The argument becomes who controls the inauthenticity. This is not authenticity. So let's say there's a teacher and a student. The teacher has a certain way that they think the student should learn. The student has a certain way that they want to learn. These are fundamentally different contexts. They're fundamentally, they're differently constructed realities, and they are in conflict. And so what's happening is each person may say, well, I want to be my authentic self. That's not even on the table. Each person is actually holding on to their inauthentic self in fear of being authentic, because in being authentic, a connection would be made that would negate, we could even say it would smash or destroy or annihilate the constructed notion that a person has of being a teacher or a person has of being a student. And in that, the person is faced with a very fundamental existential question. Who am I? How do I exist? What is existence? What is meaning? What is purpose? What does it mean to have connection? What does it mean to exist? What is the nature of? What is existence? Now, yes, admittedly, this can be a bit of a rabbit hole. But if we go back to the two people in conflict, the teacher and the student, we notice that, and we argue that, okay, each one is being entirely inauthentic, and each one fears a recognition that to be free would involve leaving their inauthenticity. Therefore, they are committed to living in bad faith. And this is maintained. There's a power dynamic, right? The teacher has more power than the student. But ultimately, what we're talking about is staying in a sphere of inauthenticity. Now let's take a look at a work situation. Two people are working in a organization of some kind, and roles start to change. One person moves up for whatever period of time, and that experience of them moving up shifts the dynamic. It's the same person, it's the same people, but now the very fact that each person is now in a slightly different role, which is inauthentic, has shifted, which creates a new dynamic, which is inauthentic. This is not about authenticity. And I can't emphasize this point enough, because I think this is the key that can get lost sometimes, is we think authenticity is our kind of utopia. Authenticity is the moment of terror when we realize that we are existing in a constructed universe and that there's these power structures that are created, and we are complicit in this form of inauthenticity, that we are acting in bad faith. Yes, we can challenge, and yes, we can push, and yes, we can in some way try and ratify our own existence to speak to a broader experience, to find a broader horizon. Yes, we can strive, but authenticity can only ever be a jolt, an inspiration, an insight. It can only ever be something that shocks us. And that shock is the realization that I am in a birdcage, that I am swimming in a fish tank, that I am inside of a context, and that this context has, in whatever way, dominated my life. And I have embraced that role. Now, another example is to take a situation where a person is, saying really negative things about themselves, really harming themselves, can even be physically harming themselves. Somebody says, why would they ever do that to themselves? Well, remember, there's a constructed notion of self that is experienced through this inauthentic relationship to self, this destructive way of dealing with self. To simply get away from that means that person is facing the terror of freedom. The idea that they have choice means they could have chosen to not do those things. And that can be completely and utterly overwhelming. Take, for example, the alcoholic. The person has been drinking for many, many years. They have physical ailments as a result. They've harmed people in their lives, family members, maybe kids, in relationships that they had. There was a lot of harm created. And that inauthentic relationship is perpetuated because the recognition of freedom would come with the recognition that there was a choice that this person could have made. And they will ask themselves, could I have made that decision before? Could I have asked this question before? Could I? The terror of freedom is the terror of choice. For a person to realize they could have chosen something shifts everything completely. All of a sudden, we're looking at ourselves in the world in a significantly different way. All of a sudden, we're seeing ourselves engage our lives in a form of choosing that does not control the outcome, that does not manipulate others, that does not make us have the life we want, our best self, and so on. What it does is it recognizes that in spite of the inauthentic existence, there are choices that we can make if, and only if, we are willing to challenge our existent framework, our inauthentic selves, in a way that breaks not what we're doing, but the implicit understanding that what we're doing is us. And that creates a sense of potential, or may create a sense of potential, where an individual can begin to think, what if I am more than the identities that are constructed, and I am then put on the tracks of those identities? What if I can be free? Now, with freedom comes responsibility, because with freedom comes the question of how does my choice, or how do my choices, impact others? The question here is, what responsibility, what agency, what integrity do we bring to our active choice? Is it to escape and to be whatever, our best self or whatever it is? Or is it to connect in an integral way that speaks to a more richly defined and a more substantive kind of connection that acknowledges we are living inauthentically, and that in spite of this inauthentic life, there is and can be choice, moments of inspiration, moments of insight, that we can shatter the ceiling of this kind of constructed way of being in the world. Because a lot of the inauthentic ways of existence, the ways of existing, are occurring in a way that keeps us going in some kind of direction, that allows us to operate, that takes things off of the, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we step out the door. Even so, if we are completely on autopilot, how far will we go in understanding our freedom? Again, if we are operating in a way that is inauthentic and we seek authenticity, yet we do not want to leave the patterns that are inauthentic, then what is the quality of freedom? So I'll offer another kind of final example to wrap this up. And this is because there's been a lot of conversation about AI. And one of the things that's interesting about AI is that it's this idea that it can produce all of this kind of content. Essentially, it's a search engine on steroids. And the idea, of course, is that it can take over. Now, I think I've said it before, but I don't think AI will take over. I think we'll just give it over to AI. I think we've structured things in our lives, and certainly in seeing how managerial speak and the ways in which we operationalize things for quote-unquote efficiencies, means we actually want to increase the amount of inauthenticity in our lives for the purpose of being more predictable. Of course, you notice what's starting to happen is that there's a kind of social pathology that comes with this, where you're seeing human fragmentation, which is a kind of a disemboweling of the human spirit, where all of a sudden humanity and people are not connecting with each other on very fundamental levels. I'm not saying they were before, but I am saying that what I'm seeing is there isn't the same kind of appreciation or sensitivity one might expect as we talk about things like AI and all of these achievements. Yet, at the same time, we seem wholly lacking in understanding that there's certain fundamentals that people need to exist. They need food, they need shelter, they need safety, and so on. And it is these inauthentic patterns that can perpetuate these ways of existing that don't acknowledge things like people needing shelter, people needing food, that don't acknowledge the fundamental attachment needs and connections that we need as human beings, that don't acknowledge that we need meaning and purpose, that don't acknowledge the fundamental ontological needs of humanity, and instead reduce them to this inauthenticity. And this is where I think there's a kind of movement towards the term authenticity, but it doesn't necessarily go, in my view, deep enough. So I'll leave it there for now, other than this idea of exploring inauthenticity as a natural part of our day-to-day lives, and seeing these opportunities to break away from this inauthenticity, not as a way of escaping it, but as a way of acknowledging that we are inauthentic and we seek authenticity. And how might we do that? So, until next time, bye for now.